Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another Business Matters program on Radio Al Ansar. Radio Al Ansar 90.4 FM in Durban and 106.4 FM in Pietermaritzburg. The Business Matters program brought to you as usual by the Minara Chamber of Commerce. You with me, Anwar Moolla. Very auspicious day today. The Hajis all have gone off to Mina. Some lovely photographs been coming through of the camps in Mina and the Hajis there. And Alhamdulillah, they all seem to be very comfortable and I'm sure eagerly awaiting their trip to Arafat tomorrow. Tonight, I have on the line with me a very interesting personality, and his name is Orin Tambo. Before I introduce him, let's say Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Radio Ansar to Orin. Orin, how are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for joining us on Radio Al Ansar. We have an interesting topic tonight, and I'm sure you're going to enlighten us a lot on the topic on hand. Orin, I'm sure a question you've been asked many times before. Any relationship to the great Oliver Tambo?
No relations. I actually wish, I was related to him. Okay. I get that a lot.
I'm sure you do. Orin is the head of investment strategy for 274 Investment Managers. 24 Investment Managers we know quite well, a company headed up by Fatima Vauda, a good friend, somebody we've dealt with quite a bit as well. So Orin is the head of investment strategy at 274 Investment Managers. And tonight we're talking about a very interesting topic, which is the proposed new state bank. Orin, before getting into the topic, I need to touch a little bit on yourself. Give us a little bit about your background and your how you got into investment banking.
I think that's very important. So I've been with 274 since 2020, but prior to that, I've been working for a consulting firm, which is based in Johannesburg, within the investment industry as well. Prior to that, I also had a couple of other encounters within the same industry. So I've always had passion for investments from my time at college. So after studying economics, I've always been pursuing and trying to be in the investment industry.
Okay, excellent. The concept of a state bank, not something that everybody is for, I must add. It's something that is a very touchy topic and something that's one of the reasons why we're actually exploring it tonight, so that we can get a better understanding of what these proposals are and we can have our say in terms of whether we do support it or we don't. But apparently you've been exploring this idea since 2014. So you got we can't think of anybody better to speak to about the state bank than yourself. Tell us a little bit about what got you, interested in this type of an idea. And 2014, almost 10 years, you've spent a lot of time researching and exploring. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I got involved in one of the projects when I was still working for a consulting firm, which is based in Sandton. So it was after the Gauteng government made a decision that they wanted to start their own state bank. So it was a provincial state bank. And at the time, they put out a tender, looking for consultants that could help them, to formulate the strategy. So that was essentially, I think, the first time that we had this encounter. And obviously, we had to do quite a lot of research at the time to try and see, the feasibility of the project. We did quite a lot of research. So I think, some of the things that I picked from my engagement at the time, obviously we have to go back into time and see how, the concept of a state bank has evolved over the years. And without really going so much into history, you would notice that, the intervention or the active intervention of governments in the banking sector rose to popularity after the World War II. That was around 1945. And it was on the back of, infrastructure having been destroyed because of the war and a lot of countries being heavily indebted at the time. So we saw quite a lot of governments, particularly within South American continent, essentially starting to pick up these and get involved in the banking sector. But it started dying down in the 80s. After some acute economic crises within that particular region. So, for instance, I think some of the countries that essentially stopped having state banks, the likes of Chile, at some point it had zero involvement within the banking sector. Countries like Mexico, and also saw some of the countries within the Eastern Europe. So around the 80s, and from that time, until probably around 2008. It's an idea that was starting to fade away, But we had the global financial crisis that happened in 2008, and we understand, as we all know, it's a crisis that started within the banking sector. So a lot of banks were under stress, and we saw governments again coming in through the central banks to provide support to banks. And what that translated was essentially some of the governments ending up having stakes within the banks. And I must say, I think from 2011, we started seeing the idea globally picking up again. So if you look at some of the major, emerging markets that we compared to as a country, for instance, if you look at China, it has got quite a lot of state banks. Probably, I think more than 50% of the banking assets in China are with state-owned banks. Countries, you look at India as well. It has got a significant amount of assets that are being managed by state banks. The likes of Belarus, Ukraine, and we know Russia. Russia is probably one of the countries that has more than 60% of the banking assets under state-owned banks. So I think it has been up and down. It has seen waves, and the global financial crisis of 2008 appeared to have sort of catalyzed, the interest in governments being involved in the banking sector.
Okay. Look, you had the experience with the Gauteng government trying to set up a provincial bank, if you want to call it that. It didn't come to fruition. What were some of the factors that mitigated against setting up the provincial bank in Gauteng?
Yeah, so what happened, just after we tendered for this project, probably 2-3 months after tendering, the National Treasury decided that no provincial government was going to form a state bank. So there was a pronouncement that was made by the Minister of Finance that provincial governments shouldn't get involved in starting state banks. So it just died pretty much very early, at the inception of the idea.
Well, I'm going to say thankfully it died at that stage, and now it's resurfaced again. For me, I'm saying that in South Africa, we have a very sophisticated banking system. We've got a sophisticated stock exchange. Our currency is one of the very easily traded currencies in the world, and sometimes to our detriment because people speculate, against our currency or for our currency, and that leads to wild movements of the currency. But we really have, at least 4 first-class, world standard banks, and obviously a whole lot of others as well, including our own Al Baraka Bank. And they provide a phenomenal service. They've as good as anything out there in the Western countries. And then now we're talking about a state bank, and I'm saying, well, but why? But why do we need a state bank when we have such a sophisticated banking system that works and it's easily attainable and easily bankable?
Yeah, I think that's a question that a lot of people will be asking out there, because you've mentioned the fact that we have got these 4 large banks. In fact, I think we've got probably more than 30 institutions that are registered banks in South Africa. Of course, some of them are foreign banks that they don't operate within the retail space. But I think what people need to also realize is the fact that the South African government, as it is at this point in time, is one of the biggest players within the financial services sector. So if you think about it, It basically owns the PSC, which is the largest asset management firm, asset manager in the country. And then it has got one of the largest development finance institution in the form of the DBSA, the Development Bank of South Africa. It has got one of the largest financier within the industrial space, that is your IDC. And then it has got, even within the retail space, because that has been one of the arguments that's put forward, that we need to have increased access to financial services. We need a bank that could probably start setting up its branches in the areas. But we do have the Post Bank, which is already doing that. It's probably, in terms of branches, the Post Bank has got more than 1,400 branches, and it's the largest in the country. If you think about small to medium enterprise, you've got many other entities that do provide financing to these small enterprises. So the government is already in itself involved within the sector in various ways. And in addition, of course, to the issue that you've mentioned, that when you look at the South African banks, we've got some of the, probably the most sophisticated. We're very competitive even if you compare the South African banking system to even the US. Recently we've had a crisis in the US, and a lot of economists would point to our banking system for others to kind of emulate in terms of how to do things. So it's I think that's a question that a lot of analysts out there struggle to get an answer for. What exactly is the government trying to achieve?
Well, we can only speculate. But in your opinion, is there a need for such a bank in South Africa?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge that you have, because currently there's been a bit of conflation of issues here. So if you want to go back, I think in terms of when the concept of a state bank became prominent within the South African space, you probably go back to 2010. Which is the time when Ibrahim Patel, the Minister of Trade, started talking about it, and obviously 2014. That's when I got involved with the idea, and at the time, the conversation was about starting a new state bank, completely new entity that's going to be playing within the banking sector. And then over time, it looks like things changed to some extent. And then because of perhaps disagreements within the African National Congress, we started seeing some questioning. Why do we have to open a new bank when we've got a Post Bank? And what we are having currently, and I think we need to be very clear, what we have currently, the idea that is being pushed forward currently is not that of establishing a new state bank, but is that of sort of corporatizing the Post Bank so that it is applied for a banking license to the Reserve Bank so that it can operate. I see that as a viable option, because essentially I think what's happening is that at the moment the Post Bank can take deposits, but because it doesn't have a banking license, there are certain services that it cannot provide. For instance, it cannot get involved in lending services. It cannot provide check accounts, for instance. It cannot get into insurance. It cannot get into remittances. So if it applies for a banking license, it will be able to provide those services. I think it's generally also good for the Post Bank, because we know how banks make money, in the sense that they'll be able to monetize the deposits. But if you don't have a banking license, it simply means that you're taking the deposits, and the only fee that you get is transaction fee that the posters are using. So if they move along that route, perhaps for just trying to make sure that they expand the services which the Post Bank, it doesn't appear to be a terrible idea. But if the government is going to come now and say, let's establish a new state bank, which is, of course, I think an idea that was being explored by the National Treasury, and we understand that there are some forces within the government that are going for that, it's very difficult to actually get compelling reasons why we would need another bank, given the backdrop that we've talked about. We've got 5 banks. I know that some people have been talking about the fact that our banking sector is not that competitive. Yes, there have been some studies which have been done, and scientifically they did find that there's some sort of monopolistic or cartel sort of tendencies within our banking industry. But if you look at what has been happening over the most recent probably 2 years, going back to 2 years, we've seen a number of banks, coming into that space. We've seen Time Bank, which is a digital bank. We've seen Discovery Bank. We've seen Bank Zero, which means that there is players that are coming into that space and they're solving that problem of competition. So now with the government coming in, it's very difficult to actually understand now what exactly are they trying to achieve. I understand some people, all those proponents for a state bank have also been talking about the fact that we need to have inclusion. But when you look at the numbers, financial access to financial services. But when you look at the actual number statistics, we are not so bad again. The most recent measures of access to financial services indicate that 85 plus or minus 85% of South Africans do own a bank account. And how does that compare globally? The latest report that was done, which I've come across by the World Bank, shows that the average ownership of bank accounts globally is about 75%. So if you got 85% already in South Africa, it means that you're already way ahead of a lot of other markets, globally. If you compare to emerging markets, the average is about 76%. If you compare against those emerging markets again, I think what you're going to pick is that probably the only country that beat us is going to be China. So the problem that you have, which of course I think makes sense, is that of active what they call the real access to financial services. So they're talking about not just having a bank account, but having a bank account and also accessing other services within the banking system. And that's where essentially South Africa lags behind. So if you look at those two statistics, the fact that you've got a lot of people that have got accounts, but perhaps not actually using them. So the problem perhaps is not just about having, an entity or a bank where people can go to. It's probably something which is deeper than that. So I find, I've looked at this and I just cannot get my head around it. I cannot really get compelling argument on why the government should be setting up a completely new state bank.
Well, you've said it. There's I can think of Time Bank. That's a recent player in the market. And lots of banks are now going digital. When you find the big banks now, there's less tellers at the branches. Some of the branches don't even have tellers. And everything seems to be going online. And here,
that's correct.
Here we perhaps are moving a step backward. But anyhow, Orin, I hear you. I think, again, we need to explore this a bit deeper. Because my thought process is that when you have a something like a state bank and it is going to end up being a parastatal, and you look at the history of parastatals coming back from Eskom and Transnet and everywhere, inefficiencies creep in because you don't really have to look after your so-called shareholders, because shareholders being government. And even if you spoke earlier about PIC being the largest asset manager, if you look at the way assets have been managed at PIC, the amount of squandering, if I can call it that, of wealth that has taken place, because at the end of the day, you know what, if it's not my money, I really don't look after it as if it is my money. And if you have shareholders that hold you responsible and accountable, then you have to account to them. And if you don't, and if you're not performing, you could be out of a job. We've been talking to Orin Tambo from 274 Asset Management, and we've been talking about the concept of a state bank. There's been a lot of talk in the media about the possibility of South Africa wanting to set up a state bank, and we thought we'd explore with Orin, who's got experience in this field, what is the state bank and how it's going to affect us as South Africans, and would it be good or bad, and are we duplicating? So, Orin, let's get back to you. Simple, how will a state bank benefit the general population of the country?
Yeah, so I think maybe just to start off from the point that you raised, which is very important in terms of the capacity of the government to manage such. It's very complex. It's not easy to manage banks. You need highly skilled people to do that. And I think you are absolutely right to mention the fact that the track record of our government is not that encouraging. So every time, even if you could say on paper it's a good idea, but the moment that you look at the track record of our government, it kind of gives you a lot of discomfort. We've got a lot of state-owned entities that have essentially collapsed because the government has mismanaged them. With good examples that you've provided, we look at South African Airways. We don't even know what's happening right now with South African Airways. You look at Eskom, we're probably going to get load shedded, any hour from now. Then you've got the likes of Denel. All those, there's a very, very long list of state-owned enterprises which the government has essentially mismanaged. And now you think about running a bank, and obviously there is this concept about the NHI also coming through. So I think that gives that gives us quite a lot of discomfort whenever we hear about the government wanting to start its own bank. And the second issue, I think, which is also very important. So I think this has been found in studies in other countries that have also done the same thing, particularly in Turkey, is when it comes to political interference. So what has been happening in Turkey is the fact that there has been what they refer to as tactical distribution of state bank lending around the time of local elections. So it's strategic lending, or essentially with the ruling party trying to use a state bank for it to win votes. So I think some of the key findings that came out there is, Turkey is very similar to some extent, I think, in terms of the political structure there with South Africa. So we've got these different provincial governments. So say, for instance, in South Africa, what you would find is if the Gauteng government is under the ANC, you might actually find that there will be a lot of branches of state banks in Gauteng. But if you go to Western Cape, which will be under a different government, they might not actually be actively involved. So they will be using that as a tool, for them to get votes. So it's one of the issues that comes with state banks. It has happened essentially across the world. A lot of countries that have gone this particular route have had that particular problem. And just coming to the question in terms of how the general public could benefit, I think we need to understand what problem we have as a country. It's one of the issues that we discussed with the team back then to understand what are the problems that we have within the current banking system. And I mentioned, I think, some of them. So one of the issues that we picked there, which it has been come out from a number of studies, was the lack of competition within the banking sector. And we understand that we need competition for consumers to get the best service from that particular sector. The second issue was obviously in terms of the access to financial services. And when you look at those issues, the question is, are we able to solve those problems, particularly with establishment of a state bank, and quite often I think the answer that you get is no. There are other ways of us being able to address those issues. And even when it comes to another issue, I think that always comes up as well, is in terms of lending. There's been accusations that the current banking system has got sort of discriminatory lending practices along the racial lines. there hasn't been, we've tried to look for hard evidence. There hasn't been any evidence. I think it has always been an accusation or an allegation to some extent, but there hasn't been any hard evidence to really substantiate, that particular allegation. So I think when you look at those issues and say these are the issues that we have, and broadly, the problem that we have as a country, if you look at the banking system, it's not necessarily on the supply side. So it's not on the suppliers of financing, but it's rather it's rather on the demand side, in the sense that we are a country which is not producing provable, profitable business plans that which the banks can actually fund. Because if you have a profitable business, usually, and go to a bank, most of the time you should be able to get funding. If you can't get funding from the bank, the other sources as well, where you can go. We've got a lot of asset management firms that have got venture capital funds, that have got private equity funds that do provide financing as well for bankable projects. So the problem is being on the side of entrepreneurship, and I think for that's the area where the government should rather be focusing on, to try and create that environment where South Africans can exercise entrepreneurship, where South Africans can start coming up with business ideas which are fundable by these banks. So I think I think that's my take on that issue.
Okay. The number in the studio, 0861904904. The WhatsApp number, 06090411056. We've got about 15 minutes left on the program. We're talking about the proposed state bank, and we're talking to Orin Tambo. And I'd love to hear your comments on the concept of the state bank, the pros and the cons of a state bank. So if anybody would like to call in, we'd love to hear from you, 0861904904. Or if you want to WhatsApp us on 06090411056, and we can ask Orin Tambo to try to answer some of your questions regarding the state bank. Orin, I can just imagine a scenario where our banks at the moment, they are very, very careful, let's face it, on their lending criteria. There's this old saying of when you go to the bank and they will pull your umbrella when it's raining, and will ask for lots and lots and lots of collateral if you want any facilities. And rightly so, because our banks are still, with all of their lending criteria, and as careful as they are, they're still losing billions of rands each year in bad debt write-offs. I can imagine the scenario with a state bank. I mean, it's gonna be jobs for pals, lending people that are not worthy of the credit, writing off huge amounts of money, and not being accountable for that. It's gonna be an absolute nightmare situation as far as I'm concerned. I, for one, would not want to have my money placed in a state bank. And in my experience in the field of investments, and you are more experienced than I am, or as experienced as I am, when we talk to people that are forced to have their pensions, for example, with GEPF, Government Employees Pension Fund, they're not happy. Give them a choice, and they'd rather be able to take accountability for their own investments and place them with institutions like 274, like yourselves, who would be accountable to them, but at least they will be in charge of their own destiny. Like this, they don't have a say in terms of where their monies are placed. They have to accept mediocre returns, and it's not a healthy situation. So we're going into a situation with a state bank, if you want to call it, and I'm saying that few people will get enriched for the right or the wrong reasons, and the general population is going to be worse off. And also, you're going to create competition for your existing banks. Competition is always healthy, but unfair competition in that the state bank is going to be government subsidized. So I for one, am not an advocate of a state bank. But what has been the experience in some of the other countries? I mean, let's take China example, but maybe not the best example because China was
it is not.
it was a communist state till not very long ago. You spoke about India. Maybe India is. I don't know if you have any examples that you can give us from India. What has been their case scenario with state banks?
Yeah, so I think you maybe starting off with China. Yeah, so the reason why I think China is probably not a very good example is because China is very good as a state in being engaged in business. So if you go to China, you'd notice that it's not just the banking sector where the Chinese government is involved in, but it's actually pretty much across the different spectrum of industries within China. So if you go on the stock exchange of China, you've got more than 200 companies that are owned by the government, but they've got a different way of doing things. They run things professionally and commercially. So you find that as much as you could have state-owned enterprises, you don't have instances of corruption. They are just as competitive as the private entities. So it's a different ballgame. I think India has also been quite good at managing its own state-owned enterprises. The other countries, obviously, I think very good examples that you can compare with is when you go to South America, the likes of Chile, quite a number of South American companies in Latin America, which were very small, more or less similar to South Africa in the sense that those governments were not actually able to manage those state-owned enterprises. So I think that's the biggest problem that you basically have here in South Africa, that we don't have any confidence that the South African government can be able to manage such a bank. And just also maybe backing to the point that you mentioned. Is that there is a misconception to some extent, that if you're going to have a state bank, then perhaps a person who couldn't get a loan from, say, ABSA or these mainstream banks, private banks, all of a sudden will be able to qualify to get a bank from the state banks. It is true that when it comes to risk appetite, it's most likely that a state bank could have a slightly higher risk appetite, simply because of the fact that, they're not necessarily profit driven. So their demand for net interest margins and tolerance for lower net interest margins is going to be slightly higher than what you get from the private banks. But at the end of the day, if you're going to establish a state bank that is going to be built on the back of these people that cannot get services from the mainstream banks, then that bank is doomed to fail. Because the reason why, you did mention a very important point, the reason why today we've got all these banks being able to continuously operate is because they've got this diversity of clients. You've got very wealthy people banking with these banks. You've got the middle class banking with these banks. Then you've got the lower income segment also banking with these banks. And if there is an economic circumstances whereby some of those segments are not able to honor their debt obligations, then you've got that diversity that helps the banks to stay afloat. But if you're going to say, okay, fine, we're setting up this bank specifically for a particular group of depositors, then it's going to be a very weak bank. And as I've said, at the end of the day, we know what usually happens. A government set up, state-owned entity, it fails or it comes under pressure, then at the end of the day, the general populace is the one which has to come back to bail that particular institution. So at the end of the day, it might appeal to certain people, but I think in the long run, it's still going to come back to haunt the same people, because we're going to be the taxpayers that are going to be funding, for the for that particular bank.
Yes, I've got a WhatsApp message has come in from a gentleman called Ibrahim Hidat, and he says, I like the idea of a state bank. There's more pluses than negatives. Ibrahim, you say I'm calling out the phone numbers too quickly. So we'd love to hear from you what what are those pluses and negatives that you're talking about. And the number in the studio again, and I'll call it out a little bit slower, 0861 904 904. So if you want to call us, 0861 904 904, and perhaps we can have your input on the idea of the pluses and negatives in a state bank. Yep. I was in China recently, and just a little digression, Orin. The one thing that I picked up, which is was very kind of strange to me, was that nobody was using notes or coins as we use here any longer.
Yeah.
I mean, I was completely blown away by the fact that there was very, very little, notes in circulation at all. I mean, when you pulled out some currency even at the supermarkets, they looked at you like they were taken aback, because everything was being paid for by WeChat and AliChat and WePay and Alipay, and from young to old, everybody was banking on their phones, to the extent where even the beggars, I mean, really, this was an eye-opener. Even the beggars, they came around with a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper was a barcode, and if you wanted to donate to the beggars, you kind of captured that barcode and automatically transferred money into their accounts. So even the beggars they would have taken the money if you gave them cash, but by and large, nobody carries cash. So even they had barcodes that they were carrying around, and you could transfer money into their bank accounts. And even people that came around selling, menial stuff like mangoes and apples and all that type of stuff, food stuff, from stores to store. And even when you bought some apples or you bought some bananas or whatever, you paid them by transferring money straight into their accounts. They didn't take cash either, because nobody's carrying cash. There's just nobody that's carrying cash.
That's
around.
correct.
Yeah, but as a South African, that was a complete eye opener. The other eye opener, which I think is going to take us a long time to get there, is that 60 to 70% of the vehicles, they were all electric. I mean, there were lots and lots of brand names I came across that we haven't even heard of here.
Yeah,
they were but the uptake of electric vehicles has been phenomenal. I mean, every single taxi at the airport was an electric taxi, and everywhere you went to, there was Teslas and other local Chinese brand name electric cars, some of which we've heard of here, like Haval and Chery and BYD, but a lot of which we haven't even heard of here. So, I mean, I don't know with our power problems whether that will be the case in the next 5 to 10 years. But certainly,
yeah, I think we're still far away from that, your observation in terms of how people are transacting in China is very important, especially to the conversation that we're having, because what that is basically telling you is that that's the future of banking. The future of banking is going to be digital. So it begs a question that we've got a government which is probably thinking of opening up branches across the country, which is essentially something that's being first out. Because even if you look at the mainstream banks that we have, they have been closing branches. They haven't, And I mean, we talked to some of these bank executive, and if they had their way, the reality is that a lot of the banks that we have today could have closed a lot of the branches that they have. But obviously, they're very cognizant of the impact in terms of employment. So obviously, I think what they're trying to mitigate is a scenario whereby they have to close a lot of branches, and then some people get retrenched. So they're doing it very gradually, but they want to get to a point where banking is going to be digital. Banking is going to be where you do your banking on your phone. And if you think about that, you need to think, where is going to be the space for government in that kind of space? in that kind of banking system where everything is digital. Do you really need to go around and argue that we need to open branches for people in the rural areas? They can just do it on their phone as long as they have access to internet, as long as they've got access to their phones. They can do banking on their phones, and we need to enable them to do that.
Yeah. Well, Orin, if I can ask you, when last did you go into a bank branch? I can't remember when last I went into a bank.
I don't remember. I haven't been going to bank branches. You can do everything on your phone these days. So you rarely go to the branch unless, there's the few services whereby banks would force you to go to a branch. Maybe that's when you can go there. But otherwise, you'd find that most of the time it's very convenient. Just do it on your phone, you do it on a laptop, you do it wherever you are. Mm-hmm. And you were talking about, WeChat, WePay in China, which is also a very important development which is happening because if you look at China, they have started experimenting with digital currency, which is based on blockchain. And we know that our own SRB is also exploring that. So a lot of central banks are exploring that. And when that comes through, it's going to change the way that we make our payments.
Sure.
It's going to fast track that movement into the digital banking. So I think, whatever, I understand, the emotions around, the establishment of a state bank, but the government needs to think about this in that particular context in terms of where banking is going.
Orin, we've run out of time. We have to take the 8 o'clock news. Please pass on my fondest regards to Fatima Vauda. I haven't seen her for a while, but hopefully on her next trip down to Durban, we will catch up with her and hopefully get her into the studio as well to talk to us a little bit more about 27/4. So lovely having you on the program. Thanks for giving up your evening for us. And hopefully we will chat again soon in the near future. And with that, I wish you all a very, very happy Eid al-Adha. And inshallah, we'll be with you again next week, Monday, on another Business Matters program. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.